In this short program, we'd like to answer the question, what is anthropology? What do anthropologists do? And then just say something about some of the major paradigms or theories or ideas that all anthropologists work with. Anthropology is the study of humankind from the beginnings of humans millions of years ago up to the present day. Anthropologists use a scientific explanation for human origins and are engaged today in any kind of human problem that you could imagine. Nothing is alien to the anthropologists. Indeed, anthropology seeks to understand the whole panorama in geographical space and in evolutionary time of our species. Anthropology is the study of Homo sapiens. That's its subject matter in its most exotic forms and in its most mundane and commonplace forms. Anthropologists study ancient Mayan hieroglyphics, the anatomy of the foot, or the music of hip hop. But always, one common goal links all anthropological projects, and that is to gain knowledge about who we are, how we came to be, and where we're going. Now, one of the most common questions I get about anthropology is, well, what do I do with an anthropology degree? One of the things that we're looking for anthropology majors to grasp are critical thinking skills. Critical thinking skills allow one to look at an object or a behavior or make observations from multiple points of view. All anthropology students acquire what we call people skills. How to engage in groups that are different from them, how to engage different cultures, and especially how to empathize with peoples who are different from them. That's a real important skill we teach in the first 4 years of an anthropology degree. Another important goal we try to get across and we ask students to think about are ethical issues connected with understanding different peoples. We ask all anthropology students to understand human origins from a scientific point of view. Now, this does not in any way clash with, let's say, a biblical view of human origins. You could certainly believe in a biblical or a creationist view, but we ask at least that you be able to explain a scientific view of human origins using genetic matter as well as chemical analysis of bones and stones that help us understand where humans came from a scientific point of view. We also ask all anthropology students to apply their knowledge about different cultures to issues of globalization. Our lives are becoming more and more globalized. Here in 2008, we're far more globalized than we were in 1998. And globalization was almost something that was an afterthought in 1978 when I first started my graduate career. But today we are in the midst of globalization, and the anthropology degree really helps prepare the student for handling a broad range of issues that stem out of human diversity, human ecology, being in an environment where people speak different languages, and being in an environment where people have different religious perspectives. These are the kind of things that we train in anthropology undergraduate to begin to understand. And of course, at the core of all of this, and two of the major paradigms that we're going to describe at the end of this program, is understanding the world from an evolutionary perspective and from a cross-cultural perspective. That is looking at the world from the point of view of where it came from and where it's going to, whether it's people or cultures, and then also looking at whatever problem we're dealing with from a cross-cultural perspective. Just take the role of music in our society. We all know the role that music plays in our lives, but music plays a very different role sometimes in different people's lives, depending on which culture they come from. For some sub-Saharan African cultures, music is not just simply entertainment. It becomes an integral part of their religious experience. Food plays a very different role from one culture to the next. Even among different ethnicities in our own society, food plays a very different role. And in some societies where food is scarce, it's not going to play the same exact role as it does in our society. So no matter what we're looking at it from a cross-cultural perspective. Once you get an anthropology degree, what do you do with an anthropology degree? Because anthropology engenders a broad overview of diverse peoples and diverse cultures, an anthropology major is well prepared to live and work in a rapidly changing world, a world where political boundaries sometimes don't seem to exist. Like oil or music sometimes crosses cultural boundaries in a matter of moments. When we deposit money in the bank, that money may be transferred to Ireland, or it may be transferred to Tokyo or Hong Kong. That's the kind of world that we live in today. And anthropology majors are well tuned to operate in that kind of a world. Because anthropology is such a broad field, it prepares the undergraduate student to go into any number of areas for advanced study, whether it be medicine, forensics, international affairs, in law, in government, business, social work, and of course the biological sciences. What will be explained later is how much of what anthropologists do is of a biological nature, looking at different diseases that different cultures have, looking at human origins, looking at different skeletal structures. There's a lot of biology that goes into anthropology. And so getting a baccalaureate in anthropology is a great place to start to go into a field like forensics or a field like genetics. Physical anthropology laboratories with a lot of genetic testing going on. A lot of those people who are doing the genetic testing, whether it's for diseases or it's to find out what your ethnicity is, those saliva tests that you can send in now for several $100s, a lot of them have anthro backgrounds. Anthropologists find employment with federal government, with state and local governments, international agencies, healthcare providers, law enforcement agencies. Of course, now, because they're dealing with a lot of cultures, want people with cross-cultural skills. Any place where cultural conflict occurs is a place where anthropologists could find jobs. In the Southwest of the United States, it could be with artifacts, with Native American areas on reservations where cultural conflict occurs over the ownership of artifacts. And sometimes you don't have to go far to find a very different culture to work in. You just need to go to Hudson County, New Jersey, where you have probably a greater diversity of cultures than you probably have anywhere in the world, barring none. There are so many different cultures just right here in New Jersey. And so those cross-cultural skills are going to become more and more important. International affairs is a real common field that a lot of anthropologists end up going into. Getting a master's in international studies, to work for the UN, to work for a non-governmental organization. There are more non-governmental organizations around today than there have ever been. Organizations like CARE, the Pan American Development Fund, Partners of the Americas. There are many faith-based non-governmental organizations, churches that run schools and hospitals overseas, often need people who have skills to work in different cultures. Government organizations like the United States Agency for International Development hires a lot of anthropologists. Museums hire a lot of anthropologists. The American Museum of Natural History, for example, in 2008 is hiring 5 new anthropologists, new positions to work with their artifacts and with their collections there. So that's what anthropology is. Those are some of the things that anthropology does. What we'd like to do in our next segment is to look at the 4 major fields of anthropology. Before we actually talk about the 4 fields in American anthropology, just let's briefly note that the field of anthropology takes on different forms in different parts of the world. If you go and study anthropology in France, they may not present to you the 4 fields like we do in this country, or in England or in Germany, they teach anthropology in a different way. But the tradition in American colleges and universities is to teach anthropology with what we call a four-field approach. And the four fields of anthropology are cultural anthropology, biological or physical anthropology, anthropological linguistics, and archaeology. Of all the people who belong to the American Anthropological Association, approximately 2/3 of them are cultural anthropologists. So that's the biggest part of the field. And then about 10 to 15% are biological or physical anthropologists, and about 10 to 15% are archaeologists, and between 5 and 10% are anthropological linguists. Some anthropology books call applied anthropology a fifth field, but there really are four fields with two orientations: the research academic orientation and then the applied orientation. First, we have cultural anthropology. And cultural anthropology has many subfields. Economic anthropology, medical anthropology is probably one of the biggest subfields. We have ecological anthropology, political and legal anthropology. Then we have cultural anthropologists who focus on particular areas of the world, such as Latin American and Caribbean anthropologists. We have African anthropology or Chinese anthropology. All of those are different specialties and subfields within cultural anthropology. And of course, it concentrates on looking at anthropology from a cross-cultural point of view, looking at cultures from a cross-cultural point of view, studying different ethnicities, different affinity groups, which is another term for ethnic groups, looking at them in comparison to one another, or looking at a particular culture or a subculture just for its own qualities. Ethnology is what cultural anthropologists do in the field. And what they write up is called an ethnography. So an ethnography is a cultural description, and it's the result of ethnographic fieldwork that's done on site. One of the main methods that's used in doing ethnography is participant observation. Participant observation can take many forms. It could be formal, as attending a formal social event or setting up a formal interview of some sort. But actually, a lot of participant observation is done informally. It's done kind of on the fly. It's done in a way that asks you to be aware of novel situations. And it asks you to actually go in, participate as an observer, and if need be, ask questions about what is happening. Much of what anthropologists do in the field is participant observation. That is, they're not going to rely very much on formal surveys or questionnaires. Cultural anthropologists are going to do just a little bit of that kind of quantitative research, but they're going to lean more toward doing qualitative kind of research. And participant observation is one of the main methodologies used when you're doing ethnographic research. Let's go into physical anthropology. Sometimes it's called biological anthropology. It's actually a pretty broad and complex field and a pretty exciting field. It's the kind of field that shows up a great deal on the front pages of the New York Times with new discoveries of human ancestors, with new data on DNA. All of that comes under the purview of physical anthropology. There are 3 or 4 major areas of physical anthropology, one being human paleontology, or those physical anthropologists that study human origins. Then you have a lot of physical anthropologists or biological anthropologists that study non-human primates or primatologists. They're the ones who do the work with the great apes, which include chimpanzees, gorillas, and bonobos, and then the lesser apes, gibbons and the siamangs. So those are also biological anthropologists. And then the real exciting work now with what we now refer to as molecular anthropologists. And these are anthropologists that are doing studies of human DNA, of the human genome. They're studying the Y chromosome in men, going back many, many thousands of generations, looking at human origins that way. Or they're studying female mitochondrial DNA, which we could trace back many, many generations. They're doing real exciting work. Some biological anthropologists are those that study epidemiology. They're looking at human diseases, such as sickle cell anemia, or different kinds of disease trends that are particular to different kinds of cultures. Some biological anthropologists study nutrition. They're nutritional anthropologists. And some of them look at health issues as they pertain to different kinds of cultures. And some medical anthropologists actually straddle the line between being biological anthropologists and being cultural anthropologists. Another real exciting field of anthropology, I think when most people think about anthropology, what do they think of? Well, Indiana Jones, of course. They think about archaeologists. And they're doing things like studying extinct cultures. They're looking at cultures of the past. Sometimes it's not as far in the past as you might think. You don't have to go back 5 or 6 or 10,000 years to look at different cultures. There's one field of archaeology known as garbology that looks at garbage from the 1950s as the kind of a culture that may only be 50 or 60 years old rather than tens of thousands of years old. But sometimes some of the most important archaeology is a kind of a public archaeology. It's not real exciting. This is archaeology that is done for the purposes of allowing the community to find out what their roots are. One of the community archaeologists in Sussex County has excavated the Black Creek site in Vernon. And this way we know something about the past of burial grounds that Native Americans established well before Europeans showed up here. And this gives local residents more of an identity and a feel for the community that they now occupy. And a lot of archaeology is exactly that. It's local, it's community archaeology, and it's helped people connect with their local identity. It's not real exciting stuff like you see in Hollywood movies. A fourth field of anthropology is anthropological linguistics. And linguists come in a couple of different forms. Some of them do what we refer to as descriptive linguistics. That is, they'll go in and they'll actually describe a language. This is especially for languages that are not yet written, languages that are about to go extinct. So what descriptive linguists do is they'll want to go in and describe those languages before they're lost, and they give a lot of help to people who want to recapture those languages. And there are a lot of examples of this in the United States. Many Native American languages are being preserved and are now being taught to young people. One of the most interesting examples where you have far more people speaking that language today than in the past is Makah. That's M-A-K-A-H. And the Makah live in Nia Bay, Washington, at the very tip of the Olympic Peninsula. There, all young people are now learning to speak Makah. It was not too long ago where you only had fewer than a dozen people who knew the Makah language. And this is one of the big projects for descriptive linguistics. One of the most important spots for looking at language diversity is in Papua New Guinea, where there are probably hundreds of languages just in that little area of Papua New Guinea than there are in probably all of the Americas. Another kind of linguistics is what we call sociolinguistics. And sociolinguistics looks at the way in which language changes from one social situation to another, or through time, the way pronunciations change. A real interesting kind of linguistic change that happened in this country over the past 50 years is a shift away from what used to be called continental English or transatlantic English. It's the kind of English you hear spoken in movies from the 1930s and the 1940s. If you go back into those old black and white movies and you hear upper class people being characterized in the way in which they speak, the way in which Katharine Hepburn would speak in the Philadelphia Story is a great example of transatlantic English. If you look at, upper class folks in Philadelphia, they don't talk like that anymore. And of course, Philadelphia, they speak different than they do in parts of New Jersey or in New York. That's the kind of thing that the sociolinguist would study. Sociolinguists also do real important research in the way men and women communicate differently, in the way they are socialized to communicate differently. They'll also look at the way in which different ethnicities will communicate differently. Those are the four academic fields of anthropology, but for each of those fields, for each of the four fields, you have an applied component. So not all anthropologists go out there and get their degrees and are able to do research or able to teach. In fact, more and more anthropologists are taking what they know and applying it in different fields. So for example, an applied cultural anthropologist, there are so many different fields where applied cultural anthropologists can do their work. For example, they can go to Haiti and they can work for one of the embassies on food programs or on programs that allow poor women to work in the field of their specialty, whether it's crafts or pottery. Applied cultural anthropologists might also work in fields of medicine, promoting AIDS programs or AIDS prevention programs. Applied archaeologists will often do what we call contract archaeology. They will work for government and they will excavate sites where government is going to put up a new building, or they will do to find out some historical significance of a park or government-owned property. So those are the four fields of anthropology and the two orientations of anthropology. There are two major paradigms that all anthropologists use, regardless of which field that they are in. One of them is a cross-cultural perspective, and the other is the evolutionary perspective. The cross-cultural perspective is one where you're going to be able to hone your skills in looking at cultures that are very different from your own. One of the tools that we use in honing our cross-cultural perspective is cultural relativity. Cultural relativity is viewing other cultures by the standards that they set for themselves and not looking at different cultures as being inferior or superior. The opposite of cultural relativity is ethnocentrism. That's when we use our own standards and our own values to judge cultures that are different from us. And all anthropologists subscribe to cultural relativity, and they use it in their work, whether they are archaeologists, physical anthropologists, or cultural anthropologists or linguists. The other paradigm that all anthropologists subscribe to is the evolutionary perspective. Now, of course, Charles Darwin was the first to put forth the idea of evolution, and he called it evolution by natural selection. And of course, today we know about genetics, and Charles Darwin did not know about genetics. And so when we incorporate genetics into our evolutionary perspective, we refer to that as the modern synthesis of evolution. And so that's what anthropology is all about. In our following lectures, we're going to cover all of the major topics in the field of anthropology, starting with ethics and anthropological methods.